Margaret Collins was a 35-year-old woman whose life moved in quiet, predictable rhythms. Each morning began the same way, the shrill buzz of her 6 a.m. alarm slicing through the soft gray of dawn, the gentle hiss of her coffee maker, and the sound of rain or city noise filtering through the blinds of her modest one-bedroom apartment in Chicago. After pulling her chestnut hair into a bun and slipping on her neatly pressed scrubs, she would head out into the city's early bustle, where she worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse at St. Mary's General Hospital. The days were long and often grueling, filled with alarms, the scent of antiseptic, the weight of other people's pain, but Margaret found purpose in it. Her patients called her Sister Margaret, not because she was a nun, but because her kindness had that rare, comforting purity that made people trust her instantly. Her sister, Jessica, could not have lived a more different life. 5 years earlier, she had married David Hamilton, an executive at a thriving medical equipment company, and together they had settled into a sprawling 2-story white mansion in one of Chicago's wealthiest suburbs. The Hamilton house looked like something out of a luxury magazine: manicured lawns, ivy-climbing trellises, a garden bursting with roses, and a turquoise pool that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Jessica had fully embraced her role as the elegant housewife. She attended brunches, charity galas, and weekend golf club parties. Her wardrobe was filled with silk blouses and tailored dresses. Her social media a curated display of perfection: sunlit breakfasts, expensive vacations, and champagne toasts. In contrast, Margaret's world was smaller, quieter, and filled with service. The two sisters had been opposites since childhood. Jessica was radiant, confident, and magnetic, while Margaret had always been reserved and introspective, preferring books and quiet afternoons to crowds. Their parents, dazzled by Jessica's charisma, often overlooked Margaret's quiet strength and diligence. It wasn't out of malice, just a natural gravitation toward brilliance over steadiness. When Jessica married David, her life transformed overnight, but not everything inside the Hamilton mansion was as serene as it appeared from the outside. David's mother, Eleanor, had moved in with the couple soon after the wedding, a refined woman in her late 60s. Eleanor had been an English teacher for many years. She had the kind of grace that came from decades of reading and kindness, a soft-spoken, intelligent woman who once led book clubs and volunteered at libraries. Margaret remembered meeting her for the first time at the wedding reception. Eleanor had clasped her hands warmly and said, "You have your mother's eyes, dear." That moment stayed with Margaret. There had been genuine warmth in the woman's eyes. However, Jessica often complained about her mother-in-law in the months that followed. "She's always criticizing me," Jessica would sigh over the phone. "She comments on my cooking, my cleaning, everything. I can't do anything right in her eyes." Margaret would listen patiently, offering soft advice. "She probably means well. It's an adjustment for her too. Try to be patient." Still, every time Margaret visited her sister's immaculate home, she couldn't shake the strange, heavy tension that lingered in the air. The house was spotless, too spotless, and Jessica's laughter, though bright, often felt hollow. Eleanor was polite but quieter with each visit, and David, usually glued to his phone, seemed more detached than before. As months passed, Margaret noticed subtle shifts. Jessica stopped mentioning Eleanor altogether. Instead, her conversations turned to the luxury trips she and David were taking: Napa Valley, Aspen, Miami. She'd talk endlessly about their golden retriever, Max, the newest addition to the family. "Sis," Jessica said one night over the phone, her tone breezy, "David and I are heading to a resort this weekend. Can you take care of Max for us? He loves you." Margaret, exhausted after a 12-hour shift, agreed. "Of course, I'll use the spare key." Jessica laughed, relieved. "You're the best. Max couldn't be in better hands." The calls became more frequent. Every week, another urgent trip, another request. Margaret didn't mind caring for the gentle golden retriever. She actually found comfort in his company, but something about Jessica's constant absences began to unsettle her. When she asked casually, "How's Eleanor doing these days?" Jessica's replies grew clipped. "Oh, she's fine, just tired, needs rest." But rest, Margaret knew, didn't explain why she hadn't seen Eleanor in months. The once lively woman who loved tending to roses and chatting with neighbors had vanished from sight. Even Max seemed to sense it. When Margaret visited, he often sat facing the hallway leading to Eleanor's room, tail low, growling softly at nothing. One afternoon, while taking a short break at the hospital, Margaret mentioned it to a colleague. "It's probably nothing," she said, though her tone betrayed uncertainty. "My sister said her mother-in-law's just resting." Her coworker shrugged. "Maybe, but trust your gut, Maggie. You're good at reading people." That night, as rain lashed against her apartment windows, Margaret sat on her couch, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, she received another call. Jessica's voice was unusually rushed. "Sis, can you check on Max tonight? We have to fly out immediately for a business emergency in Seattle. The food's on the counter. You're a lifesaver." Then, click, the line went dead. When Margaret arrived at the house around 6 p.m., the sun was dipping low, staining the horizon in orange and crimson hues. The mansion looked peaceful from the outside, bathed in golden light, but as she pulled into the driveway, her brow furrowed. Both Jessica's and David's cars were still there. That was odd. The moment she unlocked the front door, an unfamiliar smell hit her, a strange mix of stale air, sweat, and something faintly metallic. Not decay, but something deeply wrong. "Max?" she called softly. No response. The silence was so heavy it seemed to press against her chest. Then, from behind the sofa, came a faint whine. Margaret hurried over. Max was curled tightly, his ribs faintly visible, his fur dull. When he lifted his head, his eyes were glassy, and he trembled uncontrollably. "Oh, sweetheart." Margaret knelt and stroked him gently. He whimpered and looked toward the dark end of the hallway, the direction of Eleanor's room. The unease in Margaret's chest turned into dread. The smell was stronger now. She stood, heart pounding, and slowly walked toward the back of the house. The hallway lights were dim. The air felt thick and unmoving. Eleanor's door was closed. Margaret hesitated, her fingers trembling as she touched the doorknob. "Eleanor?" she whispered. No answer. She pushed the door open and froze. The curtains were drawn tight, sealing the room in shadow. The air was stale. The faint hum of flies somewhere near the window. Used dishes were piled in one corner. A blanket crumpled on the floor. The bed was empty. Margaret's pulse quickened. The room looked lived in, but not recently. Someone had been there, eating, sleeping, but now was gone. Then she noticed something odd. At the back of the room, partially hidden behind an old dresser, was a small door she had never seen before. It was low, like a storage crawl space, the kind of door a person could easily overlook. Max barked softly behind her, then whimpered. Margaret's breath caught. Light was leaking faintly from beneath the door, warm, flickering light, and beneath it, she thought she heard movement, a whisper. She stepped closer. "Eleanor?" she said again, her voice trembling. A faint, weak reply came from the other side. Who's there?" Margaret's stomach dropped. "Eleanor. It's me, Margaret." There was a sound like a soft sob. Margaret grabbed the small doorknob and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow space that looked like a converted closet. A thin mattress lay on the floor. On it, a frail figure turned her head weakly toward the light. It was Eleanor. But not the vibrant woman Margaret remembered. This Eleanor was skeletal, her cheeks sunken, her hair matted, her clothes filthy and torn. In one corner sat a half-empty bottle of water and a plate with scraps of stale bread. Margaret dropped to her knees, tears blurring her vision. "Eleanor, oh my God?" The old woman's lips moved faintly. "Margaret, is that you?" "Yes, it's me. You're safe now. I'm here." Eleanor's cracked voice trembled. "Help me, please." As Margaret held her trembling hand, realization crashed through her like thunder. Jessica's constant trips, the neighbor never seeing doctor's visit, Max's fear, the smell. All of it made sense now. Her sister, her own flesh and blood, had been keeping Eleanor locked away. Margaret's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Please," she said through tears. "I need help. An elderly woman's been confined. She's dehydrated, malnourished. Please hurry." As she waited for the sirens, she held Eleanor close. "It's okay now," she whispered. "You're safe, I promise." Outside, in the fading light, the faint echo of sirens began to rise. And in that moment, Margaret knew, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Expanded version. The windows were tightly shut, their heavy curtains sealing out even the faintest trace of sunlight. The air in the room was thick, unmoving, and carried a faint odor of damp fabric and something stale. A bed stood against the wall, its sheets wrinkled but undisturbed. No one was there. Used dishes, some with crusted food, were scattered across a small table. Dust coated the lampshade, and in one corner, clothes were piled carelessly on the floor, some clearly women's garments, though old and faded. Margaret's pulse began to quicken. She hadn't noticed this part of the house before. The shadows seemed deeper here, as if even the air carried secrets. Then her eyes landed on something unusual, a small, almost hidden door near the far end of the room. It was positioned low, beside a cabinet, so inconspicuous it could have easily gone unnoticed for years. Her stomach tightened. Why would there be a door there? As she moved closer, she saw a faint strip of light leaking from the gap underneath. The light flickered slightly, and she thought she heard something, a shuffle, a whisper of movement. Her voice trembled as she called out softly, "Eleanor, is that you?" There was silence. Then, faintly, almost like a ghost's breath, came a voice. Who's there?" Margaret froze, her heart hammered in her chest. "Eleanor? It's me, Margaret." Gathering her courage, she reached for the small metal handle and slowly turned it. The hinges creaked. What appeared before her was a narrow, suffocating space, barely larger than a closet. A mattress lay directly on the floor, covered by a thin blanket, and there, lying on it, was Eleanor. Margaret gasped. The woman who once carried herself with grace and dignity, who spoke with quiet authority and kindness, now looked utterly diminished. Her hair was tangled and streaked with gray. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked. She wore an old cardigan that seemed to hang from her frail frame. Near the mattress were a nearly empty bottle of water, a few crusts of bread, and an untouched can of soup. "Eleanor?" Margaret's knees hit the floor as she crawled closer. "Oh my God, what have they done to you?" The old woman blinked, her eyes unfocused at first, then sharpening when she recognized Margaret's face. "Margaret, is that you?" Her voice was dry and rasping. "Please, help me." Margaret's throat closed. All the fragments she'd been ignoring for months, the constant trips, the evasive answers, the dog's behavior, the locked doors, clicked together in one horrifying instant. Jessica's charm, her cheerful phone calls, her flawless smiles, everything had been a mask hiding this nightmare. "It's okay," Margaret whispered, though her own hands were shaking. "You're safe now. I'm here." She fumbled for her phone, her trembling fingers barely able to dial. 911. A calm operator's voice answered. "What's your emergency?" "This is Margaret Collins. I found an elderly woman who's been confined. She's malnourished and dehydrated. Please, send an ambulance immediately." Her voice quivered, but she forced herself to stay composed, drawing on years of nursing experience. When the call ended, she took Eleanor's cold, trembling hand. "How long, Eleanor? How long have you been in here?" Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. I don't know. Weeks? Months? At first, they said I needed rest. Jessica brought me here herself. She locked the door sometimes, said it was for my own good. Then, she stopped coming as often. I wasn't allowed out anymore. She said I was too sick to be seen." Margaret's heart broke. She pressed her hand to Eleanor's forehead. It was burning with fever. The signs of dehydration were severe: dry lips, paper-thin skin, a weak pulse. Eleanor needed IV fluids immediately. "Hold on," Margaret said, brushing a strand of hair from Eleanor's face. "Help is coming. You're not alone anymore." Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet night. Blue and red lights flashed through the cracks in the curtains. The door burst open as paramedics hurried in, guided by Margaret's voice. "Over here," she shouted. They rushed into the small hidden room, and the looks on their faces shifted from professional focus to shock. Even these seasoned responders seemed shaken by what they saw. Margaret stayed close, explaining Eleanor's condition with precision: severe dehydration, possible malnutrition. She's been confined for months. Check her vitals, she needs fluids now. As the paramedics lifted Eleanor onto a stretcher, Max appeared at the door. The golden retriever whimpered softly, tail low, his eyes wide with worry. Margaret knelt beside him for a brief moment, whispering, "It's over, boy. She's safe now." The dog's body relaxed, as though he, too, understood. When the ambulance doors closed, Margaret climbed in beside Eleanor, refusing to leave her side. She held Eleanor's fragile hand all the way to the hospital. The old woman managed a faint smile through her exhaustion. "Thank you, Margaret, you saved my life." Tears slipped silently down Margaret's face. "No," she whispered, "you saved mine." At the hospital, doctors worked swiftly. IV lines were inserted, oxygen administered. After hours of treatment, Eleanor finally stabilized. Margaret stood outside the ICU window, her uniform still stained with dust from the hidden room, her eyes hollow with disbelief. Detective Dietrich, a composed woman with gray-streaked hair and sharp eyes, arrived to question her. "Ms. Collins, we need to know everything you saw," she said gently. Margaret told her everything: the months of growing unease, Jessica's excuses, the fabricated stories about doctors, the smell in the house, and the discovery of the hidden room. When she finished, the detective sighed heavily. "Where's your sister now?" "She said she was going to Seattle," Margaret replied, but her car was still in the driveway. Within hours, authorities tracked Jessica and David to O'Hare Airport. They weren't flying to Seattle at all. They were on a one-way trip to Las Vegas, carrying fake passports and cash withdrawals from Eleanor's accounts. The arrest was swift. What the investigation uncovered was even worse than Margaret imagined. David's company had collapsed under mounting debt. They had forged Eleanor's signature to drain her savings, redirect her pension, and sell her properties. When Eleanor began questioning transactions, they confined her, claiming she had dementia. They even drafted a falsified death certificate in preparation for claiming her life insurance. Jessica confessed in tears, "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We just needed time to fix things." But her voice broke, and even she seemed to realize the monstrous truth: she had become the architect of her own moral collapse. In the weeks that followed, Margaret devoted herself to Eleanor's recovery. She visited the hospital every day, bringing books and flowers, sitting quietly beside the bed. Slowly, Eleanor began to regain strength. The color returned to her cheeks, and the dullness in her eyes lifted. "Jessica told the neighbors I had dementia," Eleanor said one afternoon, her voice trembling. "That's why no one checked on me." Margaret clenched her fists. "That will never happen again. You're safe now." When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Margaret stood as a witness, recounting the events of that night. Jessica avoided her gaze throughout the testimony. The verdict was inevitable. Jessica received 12 years in prison. David, 15. Their home and assets were seized to repay Eleanor. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom. This crime was not one of impulse but of calculation, a betrayal of trust, of family, and of basic humanity. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The sister she had once loved was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. Yet beneath her sorrow was relief. Justice had been done. Months later, Eleanor moved into Margaret's small apartment. Over shared breakfasts and quiet evenings, they rebuilt their lives. Eleanor tended to potted plants on the balcony, while Margaret prepared for her night shifts. They became each other's solace, proof that family can be chosen through kindness and love, not just blood. When Eleanor smiled again, Margaret saw something new in her eyes: hope. One evening, as they watched Max play in the yard, Eleanor turned to her and said softly, "You've given me a second life, Margaret. I want you to be my guardian, officially." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I'd be honored." The legal paperwork was completed within months. Margaret became Eleanor's guardian, and soon they moved into a modest house together. They planted roses in the garden. They shared morning coffee, evening walks, and laughter that once felt impossible. Letters arrived from Jessica, at first defensive, later repentant. Margaret eventually replied, a short note filled not with forgiveness, but with hope for her sister's change. She had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant freeing herself from the weight of hate. A year later, As spring sunlight poured through the windows, Eleanor stood by the kitchen, watching roses bloom in the yard. "They're beautiful this year," she said with a gentle smile. Margaret turned from the stove. "They are. You cared for them, Eleanor. You brought them back to life. Just like herself." They sat in the garden that evening, sipping tea as Max dozed between them. The quiet hum of the neighborhood, the golden light, and the faint tolling of church bells made the world feel whole again. Eleanor reached for Margaret's hand. "You saved me, my dear, but perhaps we saved each other." Margaret squeezed her hand and smiled. "Yes, we did." As dusk fell, they walked back inside, side by side. The lights of the house glowed warmly against the darkening sky, a home rebuilt on truth, compassion, and the courage to begin again. And in that quiet light, Margaret understood something she would carry forever. Blood may bind people, but only love makes them family.